Hello and welcome to Challenge Solutions. My name is Caitlyn, and in this video I will be sharing 10 tips for English teachers with blind or visually impaired students. These tips are primarily directed toward elementary and high school English teachers, but many will apply to college professors as well. My first tip is to maintain communication with your student and their TVI. TVI stands for Teacher of the Visually Impaired. The college equivalent to this will be the Access Office on the university campus. All visually impaired students are different. Each student is going to have a different skill set and level of comfort with English classes. I can give you a generalized list of guidelines, but ultimately only your student and their TVI will be able to tell you how to best meet the needs of that individual student. You also need to make sure that you are letting your student and their TVI know what is coming up in the class so they can make sure they have accessible copies of the materials and have a plan in place for how the blind student is going to access the material needed for the class. Tip number 2 is use accessible materials. English classes are very easy to adapt. Most of the materials that you're going to use in an English class are either already accessible or can be easily made accessible by a TVI. However, it is still important to get your materials to the TVI ahead of time so that they can make sure they are accessible and make any modifications that need to be made. This is especially important for reading material. Most commonly read books in English classes are going to be in accessible formats on websites like bookshare.org or Learning Ally or Bard, but it's still important that you get the reading list to the student well in advance so they can find accessible copies in a format of their choosing and make sure they have it downloaded to whatever device they're going to be using in your class. Otherwise, they're going to be scrambling to find an accessible copy of the book and download it on the day that they need to start reading it, which will set them behind in your class. If accessible copies of these books cannot be found on websites for the blind, Kindle copies are accessible on iOS, so if your student has access to an iPad, this is an option. Apple Books is also accessible. However, it may take students a little bit of time to get used to navigating the books if they have to read it in a format that they're not used to reading, like Kindle or iBooks. Many blind students don't commonly read books in these formats, so they still need a little bit of a heads up to make sure that they have the book in a format that they know how to navigate and can read efficiently. If the materials you're going to use are not already in an accessible format and cannot be found in an accessible format, you will need to get them to the TVI at least a week, preferably more in advance, so that they can convert them to an accessible format. It is important to note that online activities often are not accessible using assistive technology. For instance, if you have your students taking online quizzes over reading material, they may or may not be accessible to your student using their assistive technology. You'll need to have your student and their TVI test these materials ahead of time to see if they're going to work, and if they're not going to work, the TVI will have to convert them to an accessible format, or you will need to provide your blind student with an alternative assignment. Tip number 3, ask your student if they're comfortable before having them read out loud in class. If your student is a fluent Braille reader, they may or may not be comfortable reading aloud in class from a refreshable Braille display or hard copy Braille. Braille is slower than print in many cases. My reading speed is comparable to a sighted reader's if I'm reading silently in Braille, but when asked to read out loud, my reading speed drastically diminishes. This is the case for many blind people that I know. And many of us are not comfortable reading out loud to a large group of sighted peers if we can avoid it. If I have a chance to read something beforehand that I need to read out loud in class, I'm more comfortable with it because it gives me a chance to familiarize myself with the reading material and prepare for places where I might stumble over complicated words or Braille contractions when I'm reading out loud. But in general, I prefer not to be asked to read complicated things out loud in class that I am totally unfamiliar with, as it can just make everyone uncomfortable because I am a slower reader and people know that it is because I am a Braille reader, and I tend to get a lot of, "Oh, I'm so sorry, it must be so hard to read that slow" comments, and it's just not a good experience. Other Braille readers, however, may be perfectly comfortable reading in class, so it's important to just talk to your student beforehand and ask what they would prefer. Tip number 4. Understand that page numbers do not always line up for blind students. If your blind student has a book from bookshare.org or a similar website designed to provide accessible reading materials to the blind and visually impaired, the page numbers may or may not line up with the print copy of the book. These books are typically scanned by volunteers, and they often don't go in and correct the page numbers, so the front matter will read as page 1, and it will throw the entire book's page numbers off by anywhere from 2 to 10 pages, and it can be very difficult for your blind student to navigate to a specific spot in the book if you only give them the page number. TVIs can sometimes correct this, so that is an option if you catch it in time, but in many cases, it can be helpful to your blind students if you provide them with a chapter heading or a sentence that they can keyword search to jump to the point in the book where you need them to be. You can ask your student beforehand if the page numbers line up and decide how far off it is, and then figure out the best method for you to tell them where to be in the book. Tip number 5 somewhat goes along with tip number 4. This is allow extra time for your blind student to find their place in the reading material. As stated previously, page numbers can be off, but in general, navigating through ebooks as a blind or visually impaired student can take a little longer than flipping to a specific page in a print book. Blind students cannot skim read. If your student is a Braille reader, they're going to have to read pretty much word for word, and screen readers don't exactly allow for easy skimming either, especially if the page numbers are off, but just in general, it is going to take your blind student a little longer to get to where they need to be, even if you give them a sentence to keyword search. I personally preferred my English teachers to tell me where I needed to be before class, or send me an email before class started, giving me the page number and the chapter and a sentence that I could keyword search so that I could find where I needed to be before class started and bookmark it to make sure that I could get there in a timely fashion when I needed to be there for class. Many of my blind friends use this method as well, so that is an option. Another option is to simply allow your blind student a few extra minutes to find their place once class has started. Again, just talk to your student in TVI beforehand to see what is best for that student. It may also differ depending on how they're accessing the reading material, so you may need to work with them on a book-by-book basis. Tip number 6, understand that visual formatting is hard for blind students. If you have your students reading poetry where there's a lot of visual formatting, for instance, shape poems come to mind, your blind student is going to have a really hard time understanding how things are laid out on the page. Braille doesn't really give us that information in a useful way, and screen readers either don't give us that information or it's really hard to follow auditorily. Also, if you have your students writing papers, know that there may be formatting errors, and your student may or may not know that those errors are there. We have ways of applying formatting to documents, but again, we can't really see that formatting in Braille, and our screen readers may or may not give us accurate formatting information. I've accidentally handed in assignments before that had been turned yellow because I accidentally applied color to the document and didn't know. I've also had the experience of thinking that I double-spaced my document, handing it in, and getting points docked for not double-spacing because my screen reader doesn't always tell me that things are double-spaced, and I just select all and hit Control-2 to apply the double spacing, and sometimes it doesn't work, and I don't really have an easy way of knowing that it doesn't work because I can't see the screen and Braille doesn't double space. It is important to hold your blind students to the same standards as your sighted students when it comes to paper writing, but know that there may be errors in formatting. If they tell you that they weren't aware that those errors were present, give them the benefit of the doubt, because many times they really don't know that those errors are there. I personally like to meet with my teachers before I hand in papers to ask them if the formatting is all correct. Especially if you have your students doing MLA or APA formatting where there needs to be a works cited page or a specific header and footer, this can be really beneficial. I am a junior in college, a creative writing major, and I still ask my professors before I hand in papers if the formatting is all correct, just to make sure that I haven't missed anything, and so that they know that I am trying to apply the formatting and that I am thinking about it, and still trying to meet those requirements, even though it can be more difficult for me to apply it and know that it has been correctly applied. This is the method that I recommend because it is the most foolproof. It negates the need of you going to your student and saying, hey, this formatting isn't there, did you mean to do that? And prevents your students from saying, oh, I didn't know that was there, when really they just forgot to apply it. It's basically just a way of you holding them to a standard and expecting them to meet it. If they don't come to you to ask if the formatting is correct and the formatting turns out to not be correct, then you have every right to dock points from them for not double spacing or failing to do the formatting correctly. But if they do come to you and say, hey, I'm just checking to make sure my formatting is correct because you know it's really hard for me to understand visual formatting and it's not correct, and they fix it while you're watching, then you should give them those formatting points because it shows that they are thinking about it and trying to meet the guidelines that are asked of them. Tip number 7, avoid matching assignments for your blind students. Matching assignments are extremely difficult for blind and visually impaired students because we see only one line of text at a time on our Braille displays and using our screen readers. We can't look across a page at separate columns and draw lines to them. We have to scroll up and down between the list of matching questions and the word bank multiple times until we've completed the section, and it can be extremely difficult for us to remember what option we decided belonged in the blank as we're scrolling back up to the blank. If you want to have matching assignments in your class, one option is to have your TBI either make a hard copy Braille sheet of the matching choices if your blind student is a fluent Braille reader, so that they can have the word bank on a separate sheet of paper as they're completing the assignment in a document on their piece of assistive technology. You can also put the word choices in a separate file so that they can just control tab between files and not lose their place in the worksheet. Other TVIs and students will prefer that you simply create an alternative assignment, maybe a short answer assignment or a multiple choice assignment instead of using matching assignments. You're just going to have to talk to your TVI and the student to see what is best in the specific situation. Tip number 8, encourage Braille reading for Braille readers. If your student is learning Braille and wants to be a fluent Braille reader, it is important that you encourage them to read Braille as much as possible. I stated previously that Braille is slower than print and that you should ask your student if they're comfortable before having them read out loud. This is still true because Braille is slower than print, and many blind students can feel uncomfortable if you have them read out loud in class because they feel like they are slowing down the class, and a lot of sighted students can not be very nice depending on the class and grade level if your blind student has a lot of trouble reading. However, you should still encourage Braille reading. If you have independent reading time where you ask your class to read silently, encourage your blind student to read Braille instead of having their screen readers read to them or listening to an audiobook. Even if they're just reading Braille for 30 minutes a day, it's going to increase their reading speed and make them feel more confident reading Braille, so that in the event that they do have to read out loud to a group, or they do need to read a lengthy piece of literature in Braille one day, they will feel more confident doing that and it will be less of a struggle. Many blind students really dislike Braille. They know that it's slower, they think it's hard because it is hard, but the more they read it, the easier it will get. So be that teacher who encourages them to read Braille as much as possible so that you can watch them become more and more confident with it, and eventually they will thank you for making them read so much Braille. Tip number 9. Encourage your student to use software like Kurzweil 1000 and Voice Dream Reader. Kurzweil is a piece of software for Windows, and Voice Dream Reader is available for iOS and Android. These programs are text-to-speech software that allow students to listen to reading material in high-quality text-to-speech voices. They can also convert inaccessible documents like image-based PDFs to accessible formats that students can either listen to via the text-to-speech voice or read in Braille via a refreshable Braille display. These programs also offer a lot of really robust bookmarking and annotation features. So if you are teaching an upper level high school English class or a college class, they can be instrumental in helping your students annotate the literature so that they will understand it better. Even if your students don't have to turn in annotations for assignments, annotating literature helps students understand it more than they would if they were just reading it straight through. Obviously, I'm an English major, so I get a lot of joy out of annotating things that I read, and I encourage everyone to annotate anything that they want to retain. But annotating really can be beneficial for all of your students, not just your blind student. And if you want to incorporate annotations into your class in any way, or even if you just want to encourage them to do it and not take it as a grade, Kurzweil and Voice Dream Reader can help your students do this in an accessible way. Kurzweil, in my opinion, is better for bookmarking and annotating, but Voice Dream Reader is an option if you don't have access to a Windows laptop and you want your students to have access to some of these features on an iPad. Again, these shouldn't be replacements for reading Braille. Reading Braille is important, but some students simply do better if they have a text-to-speech option. Even having that audio to go along with a refreshable Braille display can be beneficial. So these are very good options if your student is an auditory learner or if they need those navigation and annotation features. These programs, in my opinion, make it much easier to navigate to specific spots in the book because they can pick out chapters and you can use the bookmark feature to go to specific points in the text and make your own bookmarks. So this is a lot easier for navigation, in my opinion, than using, say, a Braille note taker or just a Kindle book. There are many uses for these programs, so the earlier students can become familiar with them, the better off they will be. Tip number 10, challenge your blind and visually impaired students just as you would any other student in your class. It can be more difficult for blind students to excel in English classes. There are a lot of difficulties that come along with visual impairment in terms of reading and navigating documents and formatting papers. There are all kinds of issues that come with it. It can be extremely difficult for many blind students. But all blind students are different. Some blind students are going to excel in English classes and some are going to really struggle. It depends on the student. But regardless, you should always challenge your blind student. Just because they are blind or visually impaired does not mean they cannot be successful in your class and beyond. While you should make accommodations as needed, you should still hold your blind student to high standards. Let them know that you're not going to let them slide through your class just because they are blind. You're not just going to give them a passing grade that they don't earn. Make them work for that grade because they are capable of working for that grade. They may hate you in the moment for making them struggle to keep up in your class and asking them to read so much Braille and asking them to annotate literature with software that they're not familiar with and read complicated things that they struggle to read. But eventually they will thank you for not letting them slide through the cracks because of their visual impairment. Visually impaired people slide through the cracks all the time. That's why the unemployment rate among blind people is so high, and why so many blind people struggle with daily living tasks. If you hold them to standards, you will show them that they are capable of being successful. So be that person who expects them to succeed and holds them to those expectations, not just another person who lets them slide through the cracks because you think they're incapable, because they are capable. That is the last tip I have for English teachers with blind or visually impaired students. If you're a blind or visually impaired student and you have a tip that I missed, feel free to leave it in the comments below so that we can all learn from each other and get some new ideas. If you're an English teacher and you have a question or a suggestion for a future video, please leave that in the comments below as well. We love questions, and one of our team members will be happy to either respond in the comments or make a video in response to you. You can also send us an email via the contact form on challengesolutions.org. If you have a question and you don't want to leave it in the comments, or you have a suggestion, please give this video a thumbs up so the YouTube algorithm continues to know we exist. And don't forget to subscribe to the Challenge Solutions blog, podcast, and YouTube channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching.